It's February 1943. The Los Angeles offices of the Communist Party of the United States of America. It's long past working hours and somebody is breaking in. These are FBI agents and they're looking for information. It's what the agents call a black bag job. Not strictly legal and well outside the standard operating procedures for an investigation. But it's the kind of tactics that they turn to when conventional investigation hits a brick wall. The FBI's LA office has issued a report on communist influence in Hollywood just months before. But that report was very light on details. It really consisted of a list of films that conservatives in the motion picture industry felt were produced under communist influence. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover was not satisfied. He wanted more. He wanted names. So here, under the cover of darkness, FBI agents are poring over membership lists and copying details. And they would break in 7 more times over the coming years and months. These black bag operations would produce a list of more than 100 names, Hollywood actors, producers, writers, directors, all alleged communists. And that list would lead directly to one of the most extraordinary political episodes in American history. From the BBC World Service and CBC Podcasts, this is Hollywood Exiles. I'm Oona Chaplin. Episode 2, Red Menace. (1917). The end of the First World War is in sight, and there's a revolution in Russia. Radical left-wing Bolsheviks have seized control. The Tsar is deposed after 300 years of rule by his family. It was barely a month later, across the Atlantic, that the title Special Agent was bestowed upon a young man just out of college. This was J. Edgar Hoover. It was just a few days before his 23rd birthday. Hoover's first job at the Bureau of Investigation in Washington was to chase down German sympathizers. After tracking down an 18-year-old German immigrant in Texas, he recommended they be detained until the end of the war. His superiors thought his approach was a little drastic. It was 18 months later that he would really start to make a name for himself, though. The Bolsheviks in Russia were now firmly in control. Vladimir Lenin concentrated power in a new communist party and used that power to give land to the poor and nationalize banks and industry. Lenin started to write that the Russian Revolution should be a model for every other country in the world to follow. The First World War had changed everything. In many countries, workers had the vote for the first time, and they used it to demand better conditions. For a conservative-minded young Hoover in Washington, these changes were all terribly concerning. And Hoover had reason to be alarmed. There were more than 3,000 strikes in the United States in 1919. This was a tipping point in American politics. Anarchists, socialists, and communists all pushing for big change. On June 2nd, 1919, a militant anarchist blew up the front of the Attorney General's home in Washington, D.C. It contributed to a widespread sense of fear of violence for sure, but also fear of an ideology, of an idea. This was the first Red Scare, and it gave J. Edgar Hoover his break. A section of the Bureau of Investigation known as the Radical Division took on the job of monitoring and disrupting the work of domestic radicals. And they put Hoover in charge. The threat drove Hoover, and gradually he started to build biographical files on known left-wingers. In the first Red Scare, approximately 60,000 in total. He was a diligent employee. He devoured communist literature. The doctrines of Lenin and Marx, he reported, threaten the happiness of the community, the safety of every individual. In just a few years, he established himself as a leading crusader in the fight against political subversion. He led an operation to deport thousands of radicals to Russia. And in 1922, he quietly opened a file on my grandfather, Charlie Chaplin. The Bureau had started to become concerned about the motion picture industry in 1920 when they were alerted to the work of some independent left-wing filmmakers in New York. Over on the West Coast, it would be another couple of years before concerns were officially raised. It started with a report from August 15th, 1922.
A reliable, confidential informant in contract with the moving picture industry reports that during the visit of William Foster to Los Angeles, a reception was given in his honor by Charlie Chaplin, the movie star.
William Z. Foster was General Secretary of the Communist Party of the United States. As well as the people he knew and the parties he attended, Charlie Chaplin's little tramp, his famed character with a pencil mustache, was always battling the authorities. Bosses, government officials, and cops were the usual antagonists. Within a couple of weeks, the report landed on Hoover's desk.
I desire to call your attention to the attached, extremely interesting report regarding Charlie Chaplin et al. And communist activities. This report would indicate that numerous movie stars are taking more than an active part in the Red movement in this country. Evidently, they are endeavoring to organize a program for placing communist propaganda before the public via the movies.
And just like that, Charlie Chaplin, and by extension Hollywood, was linked to radical politics. Communism. The same force that was keeping Hoover up at night. The same force that was helping to stir up discontent among American workers. That same force that had led to revolution in Russia. There's a long gap in Chaplin's file after 1922. Around that time, the threat of communism took a back seat to the fight to uphold prohibition. Hoover made a name for himself as the man who chased down gangsters made rich, and in some cases famous, by the illegal production, transport, and sale of alcohol. But by the early 1930s, prohibition was coming to an end. And the movie industry was being transformed. Hollywood had changed dramatically from the early silent days. The studio bosses still had ultimate power, but there was a new artistic class in town. With the emergence of talking pictures, writers had a huge creative influence. Writers flocked to Hollywood in the hopes of having their words transformed into movie magic. And in early 1932, one of those hopefuls arrived for another night shift. His name was Dalton Trumbo. But he didn't find work at a movie studio. At the age of 23, he turned to the Davis Perfection Bakery, where he worked every night for $18 a week. As the United States sank deeper and deeper into a grave depression, Trumbo was grateful to have a job at all. Trumbo had words in his blood. He was still in high school when he was hired as a cub reporter for the Daily Sentinel in his hometown of Grand Junction, Colorado. And when he got to Hollywood, he struggled to break into the movie business. But he was managing to sell movie reviews to magazines, and that's where Trumbo started to show an instinct for provocation. The greatest curse of show people is their contempt for audience intelligence, he wrote.
The movies are the most expensive form of art in existence, and there is no one connected with film who is not in some way censored, self-censored, influenced, damaged in one way or other by money.
The voice of Dalton Trumbo himself. As much as he loved the art form, Trumbo could see the power of the producers, of the moguls, and of the studios.
Because you have to have it in order to work. Your pictures must make money.
Dalton Trumbo wanted to make and watch movies that mattered, and he thought the studios operated like vast manufacturing plants. But one of the artists that he really did admire was none other than Charlie Chaplin. He reviewed Chaplin's City Lights and called him the screen's finest tragedian who has the courage to retain delicacy and subtlety. Trumbo knew the power of stories. He knew that they could change minds and even change the world. But Hoover knew this too, which is why, with Prohibition over, he turned his sights on Hollywood again. It was the mid-1930s when J. Edgar Hoover started showing an interest in Hollywood again, and his interest was all about publicity.
I'm going to take you back to those days and show you a motion picture about a man named Brick Davis who was in the Bureau. It's the daddy of all FBI pictures. It's the first one that called us G-Men.
At first a radio series and later a movie, G-Men, directed by William Keighley, told a story of Bureau agents' exploits. And Hoover kept a tight control over the production.
The Bureau begins a kind of formal relationship with Hollywood in terms of how they're going to portray it in popular culture.
John Sbardellati is the author of J. Edgar Hoover Goes to the Movies.
Making sure that its image is presented in the way it wants it to be, which, among other things, includes not sort of turning individual FBI agents into heroes, showing always that the director, whether it's formally presented as Hoover or as a kind of fictionalized director, is always in charge.
Hoover makes friends, or rather, contacts in Hollywood. Jack Warner, one of the Warner brothers, gets the full treatment. Agents would greet him at airports, making sure that he had a great flight and could move around the world with ease. And it was Warner who went on to produce G-Men. Hoover cultivated friendships all over Hollywood. He was frequently spotted out with Leela Rogers, an actor and screenwriter who worked at the movie studio RKO, and who was perhaps better known as the mom of A-list actress, dancer, and singer Ginger Rogers. Leela was formidable. Politically, she was on the right, if not far right, and was wary of the left and its creeping influence on Hollywood. And when the phrase share and share alike appeared in a movie she didn't like, Leela dismissed it as dangerous communist propaganda. Given his tenure as the head of the Federal Bureau's radical division, this was surely the kind of concern that would get Hoover's attention. Who you dined and were seen out with mattered a great deal. Not only in Hoover and Leela's case, but around the same time, Charlie Chaplin was seen about town with a certain Upton Sinclair. In the 1934 election, the novelist Upton Sinclair was running for governor of California. He'd been a member of the Socialist Party, but he was persuaded to run for the Democrats. This is the height of the Depression, remember? Unemployment is skyrocketing, many Americans can't afford to feed themselves or their families, and they're looking for real solutions. Lauren Coodley is a writer and historian of California, and she's written about Upton Sinclair.
He came up with a bunch of incredible suggestions to resuscitate the California economy. It was called the EPIC Plan.
The EPIC, or End Poverty in California campaign, made an impact in the state, and it would make a huge impact in Hollywood circles.
He talked about things like taking over fields where there was just crops rotting and people coming in and, taking over those farms and raising crops.
Are you talking about redistribution of land?
Yeah.
Wow, that's pretty radical.
Yeah, and also taking over empty factories.
Yeah.
Workers going in and taking over factories and putting them back into production. So his whole thing was production for use, not production for profit.
Yeah.
He talked about unemployed actors going in and making movies.
Sinclair had a number of important backers in Hollywood, but the most notable was undoubtedly my grandfather.
Chaplin considered Sinclair one of his two mentors in Hollywood.
Wow.
And Sinclair often visited the sets of Chaplin's films.
Chaplin and Sinclair remained friends for years. Here's Upton Sinclair being interviewed in 1966.
You undoubtedly recall some of the notables of the film industry, such as Charlie Chaplin. Do you remember meeting him?
Oh my, Charlie was one of my closest friends in Hollywood. I used to go to his studio whenever I went there. He was a great talker. He always wanted to talk about his work, and he was always willing to show you what he was doing. And I knew him very, very well.
Can you tell us something about what he was like?
What he was like? Well, he was very kind and gracious host.
The friendship began when they're on a car ride to Sinclair's home in Pasadena, and Sinclair asked Chaplin, well, what do you think? Should we have a profit system? And Chaplin kind of thought, yeah, maybe we shouldn't.
Charlie Chaplin against a profit system? Against making money? That does not square with other stories I've heard about him.
So they're saying that he was a political influence on Charlie Chaplin. I mean, I didn't write it. That's a journalist named Greg Mitchell. It's a quote.
I guess it's just interesting because it's like my grandfather, for all of his virtues and the heart and I think the humanist way in which he saw the world, he, as far as I can tell, absolutely loved being wealthy. In any case, Charlie Chaplin supported Sinclair in his campaign for governor.
So when a group of unemployed actors formed an epic troupe, Sinclair found the time to write a one-act satire for them entitled Depression Island, which was performed at the Shrine Auditorium in L.A. Charlie Chaplin spoke at the rally, the first time that Chaplin had ever made a political speech.
Upton Sinclair lost the race for governor. But Charlie Chaplin, the silent movie star, had found his voice. And by using that voice, he'd put a target on his own back. And pretty soon, Dalton Trumbo was learning to exercise his political voice too. In February 1936, he got the contract that he'd been working so hard for, a 6-month contract with Warner Brothers on a salary of $150 a week. He'd finally given up his work in the bakery and was making it as a writer in Hollywood. It was a different kind of work and a different kind of writing than he was used to.
Because a novel is narrative, and the film is drama. And they are really two totally different things. And you can't adapt a novel to film, generally. You must transform it into film, which means you must rely much more on action. And I don't mean only physical jump-around action. The movement, the steady movement of the intellectual movement, if you will, the tension, has to be there all the time in a way that it doesn't have to be in a novel.
He became very successful. Not one of Hollywood's top writers, maybe, but his movies made money. And Trumbo was also becoming more involved in a union, one that was becoming a harbor for radical thinkers, including more than a few communists. The Screenwriters Guild. The Communist Party was, by this time, quite active in Hollywood. The party had been growing across the United States in the early 30s as employees in industrial plants demanded fairer pay and better working conditions. And Hollywood was no different. And it was something studio bosses were growing increasingly concerned about. Trumbo worked for Jack Warner, and Warner was fed up with his writers' political activities. He called them together. Dalton Trumbo stood expectantly among them. His words here are spoken by an actor.
He said our leaders were communists, radical bastards, and soapbox sons of bitches. He added that, as a matter of fact, many of the leaders of the Screenwriters Guild were even then under investigation by the Department of Justice.
Jack Warner knew that the Department of Justice, who oversee the FBI, were investigating Hollywood screenwriters. Is it possible he'd picked up that information from J. Edgar Hoover himself? Throughout this time, Chaplin was making a new movie. It was about workers and the machines of industry, a clown's take on the economics of the day. It was called Modern Times.
So what we've just seen there is a clip from Modern Times where Charlie's tramp character is innocently walking along the street.
Tony Shaw is the author of Hollywood's Cold War. Modern Times was Chaplin's last outing as the tramp. We watched a clip together.
And sees a truck go by. On the back of the truck is a small red flag, which is used as a hazard warning. It falls off the back of the truck. Charlie picks it up and runs with it in hoping to give it back to the driver of the truck.
Behind the tramp, a crowd appears, marching with him.
A leftist sort of trade union march, and then the cops come along. They arrest him because they deem him to be the leader of this, subversive movement.
It's a gag, a joke. But the movie was released in 1935, where the political climate was heated.
Modern Times is a great movie in many different ways. It points the finger at industrial capitalism, showing that people are being herded in factories like they're sheep. Mm-hmm. Charlie gets caught up in the machinery of capitalism and industrial.
Yeah, literally and figuratively.
Yeah, he gets caught up in it. So this is a criticism of industrial capitalism which runs through lots and lots of Chaplin's films, yeah, and maybe reaches its peak perhaps in Modern Times.
For me, this film, it's a criticism of the machinery, isn't it? Much more than capitalism itself.
Man is becoming part of a big machine, and we're using our human element. The film was, when it was being made, was being categorized as pro-communist, and certainly when it came out was deemed to be dangerously radical.
Dalton Trumbo kept his distance from the growing political movement within the Writers Guild. He was always writing. Even with movies to write, he was still writing articles, and with what little spare time he had, he was writing novels too. And at this moment, he had what was to be his greatest success with a book, called Johnny Got His Gun.
Well, you see, I had read about 1932 of the death of a British major. He had been wounded in 1917, I believe. Had been in a hospital ever since. They had reported him missing in action to his family. When he finally died, they informed his family that he was not, in fact, missing in action, that he had been in this hospital and had just died. And that the reason they had not notified the family was that he could not conceivably be aware of their presence if they visited him, and they could not conceivably want to see him in that condition. Well, that gave me the thought.
That thought involved writing a war story that was one of human suffering rather than glorification on the battlefield. Johnny Got His Gun is the story of a soldier during the First World War who wakes up in a military hospital only to discover that he's lost his arms, legs, eyes, mouth, nose, and hearing. The book won Trumbo national acclaim, as well as an American Book Award in 1940. His writings had resonated with an audience in the United States, an audience who were increasingly facing the prospect of joining another war in Europe. Perhaps curiously for a man who would become so famous, so notorious, we don't know where J. Edgar Hoover stood when it came to the Second World War. We do know that he was visited by an aide to one of Hitler's key lieutenants in 1938, and that he was in regular contact with the German police in 1939. But as the U.S. remained neutral, Hoover also quietly helped Winston Churchill communicate secret coded messages to U.S. President Roosevelt. An agreement the Nazis signed in August 1939 could well have helped to focus Hoover's mind. It certainly changed things on the radical left.
Most of the communists are calling for greater defense measures for America with the threat of fascism.
This is Thomas Doherty, professor of American Studies at Brandeis University. He's saying communists in the United States were pro-war in the run-up to World War II. They wanted to fight the scourge of Nazi fascism, and that only gets stronger as Hitler marched his army through Central Europe.
And all of that is reversed in August of 1939.
In Moscow, a senior Nazi minister signs a pact with one of Stalin's senior officials, a written guarantee of peace by each party toward the other, fascists and communists together.
Suddenly, the two great totalitarian regimes have come to an arrangement, and the Communist Party line changes overnight.
It was an awkward about-turn for some communists in the United States. Pro-war against Hitler one day, and against the war the next.
Literally, the day after the Hitler-Stalin Pact is signed, they reverse themselves.
It turned the politics of the day on its head in an instant. The communists reversed their position, and it made those on the far right think twice about the Nazis. Dalton Trumbo had always been anti-war. As Johnny Got His Gun proved, he was a pacifist. But then it all changed again. June 22nd, 1941, Germany launches Operation Barbarossa and invades the Soviet Union.
Hitler invades the Soviet Union, and now everybody in the Screenwriters Guild and all of communist Hollywood reverses themselves again. And suddenly, aha, they are again now for intervention, a strong American defense, et cetera, et cetera.
The communists flipped their position back to pro-war, and so did Dalton Trumbo.
You know, I don't think there have ever been more than 10 minutes of consistency in my life, because it's so hard to be consistent, which means unchanging. I am unhappy to say that I was quite opposed to this country's entrance into World War II. Now, but I'm not unhappy to say it, because there were clearly moments when the whole Western powers were strengthening Hitler, they were building Hitler. My opposition was based largely on things like that I didn't trust. the West any more than I trusted Hitler. I had no particular occasion at that time to mistrust the East, which is to say Russia, because Russia had not yet been tested.
So Dalton Trumbo was struggling with his political allegiances. He didn't know who to trust, and neither did J. Edgar Hoover, who was about to face his own moment of reckoning. Within months, the forces of Japan invaded Pearl Harbor, and the United States entered World War II. By the end of 1941, the United States was allied with the Soviet Union, with communist Russia. This grand alliance was of great concern to J. Edgar Hoover. He feared what communists were capable of, and now that the US and Russia were officially friends, Hoover worried that the radicals would use their newfound standing to infiltrate important national institutions. Institutions like Hollywood. He was on the lookout once again for propaganda in the film industry, and it would lead to the break into the offices of the Hollywood Communist Party and to seeing some pictures in a whole new light. In the run-up to the war, while Nazism was on the rise and fascists were taking control in Spain and Italy, Hollywood largely remained quiet. They didn't want to make political movies. But there was one exception. Dressed in a military uniform and with his customary toothbrush mustache, Charlie Chaplin steps up to the microphone. He's playing the part of a Jewish barber who's been mistaken for a fascist leader. The movie is called The Great Dictator. And in this movie, my grandfather does something that he's never done in a movie before. He speaks.
I'm sorry, but I don't want to be an emperor. That's not my business. I don't want to rule or conquer anyone.
In the film's closing speech, he delivers a message to the world.
Greed has poisoned men's souls, has barricaded the world with hate, has goose-stepped us into misery and bloodshed.
It's a rallying cry that shatters Hollywood conventions. He has broken character, and he is speaking directly to the camera.
Let us fight for a world of reason, a world where science and progress will lead to all men's happiness. Soldiers, in the name of democracy, let us all unite!
It was pro-democracy and anti-fascist, anti-nationalist. But for some of his longtime critics, the film was more than that. It drew attention to Charlie Chaplin as an anti-American, maybe even a communist. Coming up on Hollywood Exiles, the ideological battle for the soul of Hollywood heats up.
It was a struggle against enemy agents who had been sent to this country to disrupt our industries, destroy our morale, and damage the impact of our fighting army.
Hollywood Exiles is a production of BBC Audio Wales for the BBC World Service and CBC Podcasts. I'm Oona Chaplin. Agent Hopkins was voiced by Johnny Glynn. Dalton Trumbo was voiced by Paul Ryan. Our producers are Glyn Tansley and Megan Jones. Music by Phil Channel and sound design by Kathy Robinson and Phil Channel. Our theme is by Nick Thorburn. Executive producer for BBC Audio is Martin Smith. At the BBC World Service, Prabjit Bains is senior producer, and John Manel is the podcast commissioning editor. At CBC Podcasts, Jeff Turner is senior producer. Chris Oak is executive producer, and Arif Noorani is the director. Thank you for listening.